Greetings, comrades! What is the one thing that separates a truly free man from an ordinary one? That question will be answered by the proud owner of a blue passport from the freest country in the world. Yes, you're right, John. The finest attribute of a free man is a huge automatic gun he can buy at the nearest Walmart. The words USSR and freedom are not synonymous at all. But when the Bolsheviks came to power, one of their main manifestos was that they would build a free country where ordinary proletarians would be free from the oppression of capitalism. And to be honest, at the very beginning of its life, the USSR did resemble the Wild West in some ways. So today we are going to talk about gun culture in the Soviet Union. Did this culture exist at all? Did Soviet citizens have a lot of guns at home, or were they owned only by the all-powerful Soviet Special Services? Who could own a personal weapon? And why is this girl holding an AK-47? Today we are going to look at a lot of different issues related to guns in the Soviet Union. For example, how the Bolsheviks massively handed out guns in 1917 in an effort to get the people on their side, and then just a couple of years later just as massively tried to take them all back. How virtually the entire adult population of the country was forced to learn how to hold rifles during World War II, and how they returned to civilian life without these rifles in their hands. Finally, I will tell you why the German Mauser pistol became the symbol of the Russian Revolution, but the AK-47, despite all its enormous popularity in the world, was never a common people's weapon. But today we will only cover the Soviet period. If you want me to make a similar video but about modern Russia, let me know in the comments. And now let's go. We will start, of course, with the Great October Revolution. In fact, this is quite a difficult topic to cover, because probably nothing changed in the Soviet Union as often as the attitude of the authorities towards weapons. In pre-revolutionary Russia, every law-abiding and mentally healthy citizen could own a gun. The state did not issue any special permits, but only prohibited certain categories of citizens from arming themselves. For example, convicts and exiles, which is quite logical. Although this prohibition was not introduced until 1835, before that they could have hunting rifles if they were serving their sentences in Siberian katorga camps. At the beginning of the century, almost all citizens owned small-caliber weapons. Merchants, diplomats, coachmen, even gymnasium students. It was so cheap that at one time there was a fashionable trend among school children to duel over unrequited love. It's interesting that in Tsarist Russia there was no criminal article for exceeding the limits of self-defense. If a thief caught stealing watches or meat was killed, everyone around him thought that he kinda had it coming. At the beginning of the 20th century, Nicholas II wanted to introduce stricter gun control, as if he had a premonition of something, but did not manage to do so. The outbreak of the World War did upset the apple cart. It was absolutely impossible to control the circulation of arms during the war, especially after the country was flooded with crowds of armed deserters. In fact, both the February and October Bolshevik revolutions of 1917 were made possible largely thanks to these weapons, including German Mauser C96 pistols, which forever became part of the image of Soviet GPU and NKVD officers.
Ваше слово, товарищ Маузер!
Even Stalin himself carried the pocket Mauser of the 1910 model. The German pistol was considered an elite weapon, unlike the Nagant, which was used by ordinary soldiers and officers. But I got off topic. So immediately after the revolution, the Bolsheviks bet that the people, namely proletarians, would be their main force in the impending civil war, and therefore began to arm them immediately. The 1918 Declaration of Rights of the Working and Exploited People says in black and white: to ensure the sovereign power of the working people and to eliminate all possibility of the restoration of the power of the exploiters, the arming of the working people, the creation of a socialist red army of workers and peasants, and the complete disarming of the propertied classes are hereby decreed. So anyone could get a weapon, as long as he supported the Bolsheviks and did not belong to the damn bourgeoisie.
Everyone gets a gun!
However, However, it lasted about 10 months. Already in December 1918, that is in the midst of this very civil war, there was a decree on the surrender of weapons. It obliged all the population and all civilian institutions to surrender all serviceable and effective rifles, machine guns and revolvers of all systems, cartridges for them and sabers of any kind. The authors of the decree indicated that all the weapons surrendered are intended for the Red Army. Apparently, it took the Bolsheviks about a year to realize that not all the population supported them, and therefore weapons should be distributed more carefully, for example, only to their own army. And the punishment for failure to comply with this requirement was quite severe – 10 years of imprisonment. An exception was made only for members of the Communist Party. They were allowed to have one weapon – pistol or long gun, and the possession of weapons was recorded in the party book. But in general, anarchy reigned in the rules of gun ownership at that time, just like in the country overall. It was not until the summer of 1920 that the Council of People's Commissars published a decree on issuance, storage and handling of firearms, the first Soviet rules for handling weapons. This document forbade, for example, frightening others, senseless shooting in the air, and, my favorite, unnecessary shooting into the air in public places, squares, streets and so on. So it was permitted if it was necessary.
I'll allow it.
Two more decrees followed. The decree on hunting, which gave hunters the right to carry weapons upon presentation of a hunting license, and the decree on the surrender of any weapons by Soviet institutions. In 1924, all weapons were categorized. From then on, only smoothbore hunting weapons were allowed for personal possession by ordinary citizens, not party members. The authorities realized that it was much safer to deal with an unarmed population. Under the new Criminal Code of 1926, illegal possession of firearms and aged weapons could carry a sentence of up to 5 years. The public still had access to weapons, but only within the framework of state-regulated firing ranges, and not many of these were available. However, even such restrictions did not help the Soviet authorities to completely disarm the country and avoid incidents. For example, the assassination of Stalin's ally Sergei Kirov by Leonid Nikolaev in 1934. Nikolaev had been a party member for about 10 years and was allowed to have a revolver. In addition, the population had quite a few illegal guns. The Bolsheviks only conducted searches after major armed robberies and murders, and many people in the USSR realized that sometimes it was worth keeping a pistol or a shotgun somewhere in the basement, just in case. Also, a rifle, a naval dirk or a pistol were signs of social status for the Bolsheviks. The higher your position in the party during the Civil War, the more honorable weapons you were given, and no one wanted to part with these reminders of their former merits. Then came the Great Patriotic War, and the ordinary population was now forced to arm themselves. But even during the terrible World War, when it seemed necessary to arm everyone who could somehow hold a weapon in his hands, the Soviet authorities did not forget about control. Weapons were distributed freely only to Red Army soldiers and officials. Civilians, on the other hand, were obliged to surrender all personal hunting weapons to the Red Army for defense against German invasion. The same applied to weapons left behind by retreating Nazi invaders during the war. They had to be handed over to the Red Army, the NKVD or local Soviet authorities within 24 hours. In case of theft of weapons, citizens were also held criminally liable, according to wartime laws. However, in addition to the stick, there was a carrot. There was a monetary reward for turning in German weapons. Nevertheless, by the end of the war, a substantial part of the population not only owned guns, but also knew how to handle them. Almost immediately after the victory, mass seizures began again, with little enthusiasm from anyone. As it always happens after any war, the crime rate was quite high, and an armed man felt much more secure than an unarmed one. Moreover, it was difficult to carry out this disarmament. There were so many weapons and ammunition left in the battlefields that seized arsenals were quickly replaced by new ones. Only after Joseph Stalin's death in 1953 did the USSR undergo a small wave of liberalizations of civilian gun ownership. Soviet civilians were once again allowed to purchase smoothbore hunting shotguns without having to present hunting licenses. Also, trustworthy citizens, party members and those without criminal records were officially allowed to own pistols. It was now perfectly legal for war veterans to keep trophy weapons at home, if they managed to hide them for a period when it was in fact illegal. However, even this did not last more than 6 years. Purchasers of shotguns once again had to pre-register with the Soviet Hunters Society from 1959. In order to join it, it was necessary to have 2 recommendations from hunters with at least 5 years of experience. With the introduction of the new criminal code in 1960, the penalty for illegal possession of firearms was significantly reduced to 2 years imprisonment, while possession of close combat weapons was no longer prohibited in the Soviet Union. 14 years later, the penalty for illegal acquisition, possession and carrying of weapons was again increased to 5 years imprisonment. However, voluntarily surrendered unregistered rifles were met with no criminal liability or punishment. So, as you can see, the rules of possession and storage of weapons were changed in the USSR like 10 times. Tightening, then softening, then tightening once again, which for 80 years of the country's life was too often. However, ordinary citizens still generally could not count on officially acquiring any other gun than a hunting shotgun. And to buy even a simple bolt-action hunting rifle of Lost type, you had to prove that you were not just a hunter, but were engaged in professional hunting and handed over your trophies to the state. So, who could own a gun in the USSR? Let's take the instruction of the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs of 1960 as a basis. So, if you are an ordinary person with a hunter's license, you had access to smoothbore hunting shotguns, air rifles and pistols, but only possession, not purchase, and only until 1975. If we are talking about rifled firearms, then civilian institutions and agencies could acquire such weapons for arming security personnel, arming individuals authorized to carry weapons, for production and research, training and sporting purposes, for hunting, for filming motion pictures, and for display in museums. The instruction also provided for the possibility to purchase small-bore rifles upon permission of the police authorities for the following categories of citizens: professional hunters, amateur hunters who had signed an agreement for the delivery of furs and meat to the state, masters of shooting sports and first, second or third class sportsmen, military personnel, KGB and MVD officers. In addition, in some cases at the discretion of the top police officers, individual permits could be issued for the right to purchase and keep small-bore or even bigger caliber rifles. They could be issued to individuals from the party and Soviet activists, heads of institutions or enterprises, and some amateur hunters. That is, for special merit and in a very limited number of cases. Since 1975, those wishing to arm themselves were required to obtain certificates from narcological and psychoneurological centers. In addition, the candidate was checked against police databases. Weapons were inaccessible to persons who violated public order, abused alcohol, had criminal convictions and indictments, or were released on surety. As you can see, since 1918, the Soviet state has sought to control the circulation of weapons in the country, providing for the possibility or necessity of having weapons for some categories of citizens and preventing the possibility of having them for others. At the same time, there was a strict class approach to the right to bear and keep arms, especially in the first stages of the development of the Soviet state. Not only the army and police had weapons, but also party members, while members of the oppressive social classes were strictly forbidden to own them. Then, when all of the bourgeois and kulaks were defeated, the circle of persons with access to weapons was further narrowed. At the same time, this did not exclude the possibility of obtaining a permit to carry and keep weapons for those citizens who needed them for their jobs or positions. Could a certain culture of gun ownership develop in the country under such conditions? In its usual form, probably not. The Soviet Union lived by the principle that a Soviet man should defend the state, not himself, with the weapon in his hands. For the same reason, for example, the great AK-47 is probably more popular in the world than in the USSR and Russia. Yes, Soviet citizens were proud that such an iconic weapon had been developed in their country, but they could hold it in their hands only during military training and compulsory service in the army. No one kept Kalashnikovs at home. Nevertheless, even if we are talking about the late USSR after the tightening of laws in the 1960s, the Soviet gun culture had some peculiarities. First of all, they taught how to handle weapons from childhood. Any high school student in any Soviet school, that is a boy of 14-15 years old, could handle a rifle and/or a Kalashnikov. It was taught in classes. There was a subject called PMT, Primary Military Training. Schools had their own shooting ranges where high school students fired air rifles or small caliber .22 rifles like TOZ-8s. There were shooting competitions, war games, the same Zarnitsa I told you about in this video. Secondly, there were quite significant distinctions by region. While in the cities the circulation of weapons was closely monitored, in villages and settlements somewhere in Siberia guns for hunting were sold literally in village stores, next to salt and matches. And it was considered absolutely normal to teach children to hunt from childhood, to send teenagers to buy ammunition, and from 12-13 years send them alone to the forest with a shotgun to get a pheasant or a hare for dinner. Where could you buy a shotgun in the city? Mostly in sports stores, with a passport and a hunting license. There were shortages here too, you had to wait for the right gun and manage to buy it in time. What about illegal weapons? The underground market for combat firearms mainly included weapons imported from the North Caucasus as well as Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia. There were also a small number of semi-underground craftsmen who could produce the desired weapon at home, mostly in traditionally gun-making cities such as Tula or Izhevsk. Explosives were obtained by processing World War II shells, which were preserved in huge quantities both at battlefields and in unused military warehouses. However, they were usually used not for some kind of banditry, but for illegal fishing. Also, a large number of unaccounted weapons that were purchased during the thaw years of 1953 to 1959 later also resurfaced on the black market, including already in modern Russia. Finally, sometimes weapons were stolen from military units or law enforcement officers were attacked, but this rarely happened. The most popular illegal weapon was the obrez, a sort of legally purchased hunting shotgun. Overall, the situation with weapons in the USSR was somewhat paradoxical. On the one hand, almost all citizens knew how to handle them to a greater or lesser degree. They learned it during lessons at school, classes at a pioneer camp, and service in the army. There were gun ranges in almost every school and in every park of culture and leisure. But the Soviet authorities were very reluctant to allow citizens to own guns, trying to control their distribution very strictly. There was only one exception, and that was hunting. Apparently, the love of hunting and its prevalence among Soviet people was so strong that even the all-powerful Soviet machine realized that it was pointless to fight this passion. This video was brought to you by Petr Ilich, so big thanks to him. And a shout out to my biggest Patreon supporters: Take221, Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Berze, Jody Lemont, Jimmy Albin, Eli, Petr Ilich and Bruce Eternik. See you guys next time.